So let's talk about crafting a ravenous swarm of biohorrors from beyond the galaxy, with a few thoughts on collecting Tyranids in Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of getting a fresh swarm on the tabletop, talking through why you might want to collect an army of the Great Devourer, some ideas for planning out a collection, ideas for some miniatures to start with and where to expand on from there, and a few thoughts as to Tyranids in-game right now. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up, why might you want to collect an army of Tyranids in Warhammer 40k? Tyranids certainly are one of the more iconic Warhammer 40k factions, fairly instantly recognisable. The Great Devourer that rears its head from beyond the galaxy. We don't know how many are out there, but with each invasion swarm Hive fleet that hits the galaxy like a hammer blow, the Tyranids seem to be stronger, smarter and more adaptable, guided by the mysterious will of the Hive mind. When Tyranids make war, it's usually en masse, with great overwhelming numbers, destroying a world's defences, and then stripping it bare of all biomass, devouring entire worlds, and using all living material to create yet more Tyranid organisms, feed the fleet, and continue the onslaught on the galaxy. So far in 40k there have been 4 great tyrannic wars: the enormous forceful blow of Behemoth that fell on Ultramar, the insidious tendrils of Kraken, and now the powerful, intelligent and adaptable Leviathan strikes both from the western fringe of the galaxy and below the galactic plane. In battle, the Tyranids are a horrifying foe to fight, ever-evolving bioforms of all shapes and sizes to deal with every battlefield need, fused with symbiotic weapon beasts and making war with horrendous living ammunition, often firing grubs that will burrow into their foes, or all manner of horrendous biotoxins and poisons. Monstrous creatures fill the role of living battle tanks, and the power of the Hive mind has a frightening psychic presence, blocking out lesser psychers from the warp entirely, and strange unknowable psychers can blast the enemy apart with warp lancers. I think it's fair enough to say that Tyranids are one of the single greatest threats of all the races out there in Warhammer 40k. Miniatures wise, the Tyranids are one of 40k's older and more established factions, really quite a large range of options within their codex, and units that can fit most normal battlefield roles, lots of swarms, mid-sized bugs, and great big monstrous creatures. Most of their range is fairly modern and updated now, given that they had a fairly enormous release at the start of 10th edition, which replaced a whole bunch of kits that were kind of crying out for updates in their own way. Their aesthetic is that of kind of semi-insectoid aliens, hard bony carapaces over sort of lithe muscled bodies. As they go, they're perhaps one of the easier factions to paint up and get looking good on the tabletop. Quite a lot of the work just literally on executing the look of their carapace and their underbelly, and you can have some good results with dry brushes and contrast paints if you have a mind to. For a few examples of creatures out of their range, here on the left we have a psycho-devouring tick-like psychophage, a great big hungry feeder beast of an organism, a sinister hovering neurotyrant, commanding lesser beasts with synapse and having a powerful psychic attack. Perhaps the rank and file overwhelming number swarms at the front are the termagants, though even these are armed with the fairly horrendous flesh borers whose grubs can burrow into your flesh. And the fighting elite of the army are Tyranid warriors, equipped with a large variety of weapon biomorphs, and also acting as command and control nodes for the Hive mind. On the left here we have some sinister hovering venomthropes, producing great spore clouds to shroud the rest of the army from being shot down. A harpy is swooping over the sky here, a flying monstrous creature equipped with some heavy venom cannons, and on the right we have the enormous walking living battle tank that is the Tyrannifex, the enormous rupture cannon having enough force to end most enemy tanks in a single shot. Price-wise, as they go, Tyranids are fairly middling for Warhammer 40k. Plenty of their kits have okay points per dollar, though a few of them do lag behind. There's definitely a fair few 40k armies that are just a bit more expensive than they are on average. In 10th edition, they're arguably a bit cheaper than they usually are, given that they've got some good presence in starter box sets, and there's been lots of copies of the Leviathan Box going round. At least for certain models that release at the start of 10th edition, you can get those miniatures together for a lot cheaper than you would normally be able to in 40k factions. For their gameplay, I'll cycle back towards it at the end of the video, but their current rules are found in Codex Tyranids, one of the first codexes of 10th edition, and they've got really quite a wide variety of playstyles open to them, perhaps more optimised lists tending to have at least a fairly good mix of range and melee, possibly a few big monsters to deal some heavy damage, some synapse organisms to command and control the swarm, plus some stealthy skirmishers to do objectives and confound the foe, things like lictors and gene stealers. Their core rules are synapse to give you some morale defense for things near your leader beasts, but it does mean their leadership abilities are kind of poor outside of that. And Shadow in the Warp gives everyone on the table a once per game mass battle shock test, which can give you quite a powerful swing against the opponent if they get a bit unlucky. Just in the Tyranids army in general, you can play fairly heavily into morale and battle shock things if you want to. The Codex has 6 different detachments, which I'll mention in a bit more detail later, a fair few different army archetypes on offer, and 3 of them are fairly commonly played in competitive games right now. Army strength in 40k does tend to wax and wane, though they currently are fairly well balanced. Tournament win rates around about 49% at time of recording. In any case, if you want to control a swarm of ravenous and hungry Xenos, overwhelming the battlefield with swarms, monsters and bioweapons, the Tyranids might well be for you. If you do decide to collect a Tyranid army in 40k, there's a fair bit of planning and things that you can do to decide what sort of swarm you might want to wind up with. Codex Tyranids might not be the worst place to start. All the rules for fielding the army, plenty of lore background and pretty pictures of models, though bear in mind rules wise it has had a few updates since release digitally. You can find some patches in the balanced data slate as we'll get onto. Otherwise though, plenty of other sources for rules out there. Battlescribe, New Recruits and Warhapedia can all be handy for list building and theory crafting. And you can certainly try some practice games before you've even got any models, use Tabletop Simulator or proxy some miniatures for other things to decide whether or not you like the general feel of the faction. There's tons of content out there on YouTube as well. I made a recent Tyranids tier list myself, talking through a few of the pros and cons of the various biohorrors out there. I'll leave that one links down in the video description, but there's far more than that. Lots of battle reports, painting guides, and lore videos in abundance on other channels, plus plenty of other people covering units and gameplay. I'd recommend following along with social media type things as well. It can be helpful to know what other collectors are thinking and talking about, plus be a good place to ask some questions to experienced hobbyists. All the major 40k factions have Facebook pages, subreddits and Discord servers. I certainly recommend the Tyranid Hive Discord server, and I feel like they're all pretty good shortcuts to knowledge to see what other collectors are talking about. Otherwise, while you're at the start of the army, it might just be worth having a thought as to exactly what sort of army you want to wind up with at the end of the day. Maybe drafting out an 1,000 point or 2,000 point list, maybe using Battlescribe or New Recruit or Warhammer's app. In general, when collecting Warhammer 40k, the majority of collectors tend to build balanced to some extent, maybe starting with some discount deals and then adding in units as appeals to them in terms of unit looks, rules, or what's just cool or easily available. But I certainly feel like Tyranids are an army where you could easily build 2 very different army styles if you wanted to, if you had a clear vision for one type of force that you wanted to see on the tabletop. Perhaps for more common Tyranid archetypes, you could do a Nidzilla force of a whole host of huge monsters striding around the tabletop, take plenty of Carnifexes, Exocrines, Tyrannifexes and Maleceptors and everything. You can put a lot of chunky wounds and monster on the board. You could do a massive horde of Termagants and Hormigons, and maybe use the unending swarm formation to fill them in. You could do a sneaky and subtle force of stealth Tyranids with a focus on Lictors, Gene Stealers, and maybe other Vanguard Invader type things. Likely the Vanguard Onslaught detachment will be good for that. Or maybe think about the sort of way that you want to deal damage for the army, maybe going full range versus full melee Tyranids. They do have strong options for both, though I'd say typically in 40k 10th edition you may be a bit rewarded to do at least a little bit of each. Otherwise, as mentioned, there's plenty of well-known Hive fleets. You could build around a notable one from the lore and paint it up in their colour scheme, maybe try and tailor to their fighting style a little bit. Or you could choose one of the detachments for the Codex, taking primarily things that work well with those rules. Here are the Codex Tyranids detachments. Running through them just in brief, the Crusher Stampede is monster themed. I'd personally say not really the most powerful formation, though some people have had success with it. Pretty much all of its support is tailored to monster units only. I feel like a few of the supporting options and stratagems are perhaps a little bit borderline. Vanguard Onslaught is an infiltration, speed, and Vanguard Invader themed detachment, so basically anything with wings gets help there, or anything that's stealthy like Lictors, and now also the Burrowers got put into that, so Raveners and Morlocks and Trigons. That's pretty tricksy and is fairly powerful. The Unending Swarm is all about mass swarms of Tyranids, helping out endless multitude units like the Termagant variants. Assimilation Swarm is one of the weirdest, a Tyranid devouring a planet force with a focus on the harvester organisms like the Psychophage, the Auspex or the Pyrovore. Synaptic Nexus is all about the power of the hive mind, really doubling down on those leader organisms and giving buffs to things that manage to stay within the synapse web. And finally, Invasion Fleet is the big and well-rounded one. Hyper adaptations to tailor to the enemy's list a bit if they brought a skew of all one thing, and a few powerful damage and defensive stratagems. Currently at time of recording, Vanguard Onslaught and Invasion Fleet are perhaps rated as the best by most players, usually the most common plays in competitive games and certainly get some success, followed by Synaptic Nexus after that most likely, though in general players have had some pretty good success with literally all of these. I certainly say they're all viable enough to play with at a more casual level at least. You just might struggle to win tournaments with some of them more so than others. Otherwise, for theming Tyranids, as mentioned, you could collect one given Hive fleet from the lore. These currently don't really have specific rules in game like they might have had in the past, like in 9th edition the Behemoth units got a bit better in close combat, but in 10th edition Games Workshop has chosen to separate paint from rules, so basically any one of these Hive fleets can use any one of those above mentioned detachments. Most of these have some fun backstory behind them, Behemoth with its massive hammer blow tactics and being famed for its carnifexes, Kraken being fast and stealthy, maybe using a lot of rushing gene stealers in the past. Leviathan is well-rounded and adaptable, maybe a focus on some synapse things and attacking from underground and above ground all at the same time. Jormungandr are the tunneling Tyranids, Kronos the anti-psycho ranged Tyranids, Gorgon having a million different toxins to lay the enemy low, and Hydra all about swarming the enemy with overwhelming numbers. There's plenty more beyond that, and you can absolutely make up your own Hive fleet and colour scheme if you want to. It's certainly a big galaxy out there. Talking of paint schemes, early in the process I would paint up a test model. Likely a standard Termagant or Hormagaunt would be a good start to get going with. They're fairly well representative of the faction as a whole and a lower investment versus a big character or monster. As mentioned, Tyranids aren't really considered to be the hardest army to paint up, at least on a model by model basis. Dry brushing can get you a really long way, both on the underskin and also on the carapace type colours, as can contrast paints. Depending on the army that you go for, you might well have quite a lot of models to paint up though, with plenty of hordes and swarms and things, though it's perfectly possible to build Tyranids without going too model heavy at the moment. Maybe not having a million different textures on the model helps out a bit with that, at least compared with other more modern Games Workshop miniatures. You can have miniatures that look really quite striking with maybe just 3 or 4 colours on the entire miniature. There's plenty of good painting guides online and here on YouTube, particularly for the major Hive fleets. Games Workshop have quite a few all of their own, but there's loads more from other creators with all sorts of fancy ways that you can execute some great looking colour schemes. Can be nice just to have a look at what some other people do, maybe try and apply it to your own colour scheme, maybe to give a bit of a twist with some other things that you'd like to try out. All planning aside, let's talk about miniatures. What could be some of the best ways to get going with a Tyranid's army? Usually when just starting out, I'd be tempted to get a good number of models on the board and focus a bit more in terms of quantity for your money so you can get some miniatures on the table and start playing games and then start expanding outwards from there. Given it's 10th edition, I'd absolutely be tempted to pick up a 40k starter set or an ultimate starter set. These currently are objectively the way to go and not the Combat Patrol box set, though even these might be a bit redundant to the Tyranids half of the Leviathan box set if you can find it going at a reasonable price in your area. Otherwise, if you just want to have a minimal investment and get some Tyranids on the tabletop without breaking the bank too much, you could think about a box of Hormagaunts or Termagants, or perhaps the 40k introductory set if you want the deal that has a few Space Marines and paints inside of it as well. They're all slightly lower investment than the starter sets, though I feel like they're not all that expensive compared with Combat Patrol boxes. Starting with the Combat Patrol set, this one's £100, €130 or $168. Objectively compared with the rest of the Combat Patrol boxes in Warhammer 40k, it's genuinely not bad. You do get more plastic for your money than most other Combat Patrols out there, lots of hordes, 8 elitish infantry, 1 character and a small monster. That's far more than most factions get, and all of these are fairly recent miniature sculpts as well. The reason that you shouldn't get this one though is that you can get these exact same miniatures directly cheaper via starter sets. So if you do pick up one of these specific box sets, you kind of have objectively wasted a little bit of money there. Not exactly the end of the world, but it just makes sense to go for starter sets as they're both cheaper and you get some more random free marines. If you want the lower price entry option for the Combat Patrol miniatures, then pick up the 40k starter set. This one's £67.50, $112 or €87.50, so around about $55 cheaper than the Combat Patrol. That gets you all the miniatures in the Combat Patrol minus those Barb Gaunts, but costs you massively less and also gets this small force of Space Marines thrown in completely for free. At least if you're comparing with the Combat Patrol set, you get 20 Termagants armed with Flesh Borers, the Winged Prime, Psychophage, 3 of the Von Ryan's Leapers, which are the sort of mini Lictor squad variants to infiltrate into the midfield, and a couple of Burrowing Ripper Swarms. I bear in mind that these kits are monopose ones, there's no flexibility in them, and the Termagants don't get the options to say arm them with Spine Fists or their special weapons out there, but you do get quite a lot of bugs for the money, and objectively I think they did fairly well with the miniature sculpts here. If going the starter set route, the other option is the ultimate starter set, which is around about double the cost of the regular one. On the Tyranid side of things, this only gets you the one extra squad of Barb Gaunts. The Space Marines get a Librarian, and otherwise you get a bit of terrain to have your armies fighting over. It really depends on whether or not you want a small core rulebook, a bunch of terrain, and some Barb Gaunts and a Terminator Librarian. Or if you just literally want to focus on miniatures, you might well be better with the starter set and just buying the squad of Barb Gaunts separately if you want to be able to take the Tyranid Combat Patrol in Combat Patrol games. In terms of in-game strength, I'd say that the units contained within are literally all usable, but maybe not the absolute most standout Tyranid threats. They're all kind of okay at dealing damage to lighter infantry and don't really have any serious bite to be able to take down heavy hitters. So if you were to start with this, I'd pair them with some things that can take down elite infantry and tanks and vehicles as the next priority. When picking up 40k miniatures in general, I bear in mind the different options that you have available to you. Direct from Games Workshop and the Warhammer stores and website is the most reliable, but also the most expensive. Whenever I'm picking up newer plastic kits, I generally tend to go via local gaming stores or online discount retailers, usually giving somewhere between 10 and 20% off Warhammer, and are all officially supplied and stocked by Games Workshop. I do have a number of those discount stores linked down in the video description. Element Games in the UK for 15% off usually, Wargame Portal for 15% off in the USA, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off Warhammer miniatures there, and Feminist Workshop in Canada for 10% off there. You can check those out down in the video description if you're interested. Those links are affiliate links as well, so help to support the channel for any people who are buying through them. A small portion of the profits goes to help Auspex Tactics and keeps the videos coming, though it doesn't cost you any more when you buy at all. In any case, a big thank you to you folks who are using those on things that you would have bought anyway. There's plenty more options beyond that though. The second-hand market is absolutely worth a look for Tyranids. They're a very popular faction, and more so than usual in 10th edition. You'll have lots of people buying and selling things, plus also if you wanted anything from the Leviathan box set or the starter sets, you can often find completely new miniatures going for far less than you'd be able to get them from Games Workshop. Obviously for actual pre-owned miniatures, quality can be variable, so make sure you can get a good look of the miniature in question. Otherwise, in this day and age, 3D printing and third-party manufacturers exist. Lots of pretty great alternative sculpts out there that basically have their own legally distinct miniatures that aren't close enough to Games Workshop to tread on their toes, but can be used as proxies in a pinch, particularly for Tyranids with ever-evolving alien swarms. It kind of makes sense that you might have all sorts of weird and wonderful things out there, and there are plenty of creators that make some cool stuff. Here's just a couple of fun ones that I've seen that could be appropriate for Tyranid armies that have featured on the channel in the past. Say the Iron Hive of the Maker's Cult make some sort of robo-swarm type things that could be appropriate for working with the Tyranids. I do really quite like those miniatures. I think there's a lot of creativity. And also One Page Rules has their race of alien devourers called the Alien Hives. Again, they do have all sorts of models within their range that could be appropriate for using with Tyranids. Refocusing on new plastics from GW though, the other big one to talk about is the Leviathan box set that came out at the start of 10th edition. It was essentially a one and done box set, but they did produce really quite a lot of it, so it's been in stock around the world in lots of places. It originally cost £150, 200-ish euros or $245. For the most part, it tends to be sold out of most web stores around the world online, but it's not the most uncommon to be able to find physical copies of it in brick and mortar stores. I know that the standard Warhammer stores had a bunch of copies of it for quite a while, plus people reselling copies of it that they picked up earlier on Amazon and eBay. While the top line price of the box is expensive, it's still widely regarded as one of the best deals Games Workshop has ever done, far better than Battle Forces of a similar sort of price tag, and basically contains everything that you get in the Ultimate starter set, plus a Neurotyrant, Screamer Killer, and 11 Neurogaunts, plus a big rulebook and a whole ton of Space Marines. You could try and find yourself a new and unopened copy of it, where even if it has been marked up a bit since those initial prices, it's still likely to be an overall good deal. Or if you want to keep things a bit more focused and not get a whole load of Space Marines, even if they are at a fairly good deal, you could try and find someone selling a Tyranid box half for it. Just taking a quick look at eBay at the moment, you can find them for around about £85 here in the UK or $120 in the USA. In all honesty, that is pretty great, cheaper than a regular combat patrol, and getting far more miniatures than you'd find in an average combat patrol. These will gradually get harder and harder to find at reasonable prices as the years go on, but at time of recording they are pretty attainable. Otherwise, let's talk about a few other options for expanding the army. It might be worth focusing on the Termagant standard swarms as the rank and file just first, and bear in mind that they basically have two different options for the kit. This individual one at £28 or $45 or the monopose ones that you get from the starter sets and Leviathan. The difference is that these ones have the options for the Devourers and the Spine Fists, plus 3 special weapons that you can include in the unit if you'd like to. Typically going thinking is that Spine Fists and maybe some but not all of the special weapons could be worth it, where the Leviathan and starter set ones come with just flesh borers. Kind of depends as to how far you go with this. I've certainly played against plenty of people just proxying flesh borers as Spine Fists if they want a more optimal list, which I've got nothing against really, as they look very pistolish to me. I feel like collecting triple the amount of Termagants to have 3 different weapon loadouts is probably playing into Games Workshop's hands a bit. If you want the special weapons, then usually you can probably find enough bits to kit bash from other Tyranid kits that you might pick up, and personally I think I'd err on the side of cheaping out a bit and erring on the side of those flesh borer gaunts. Otherwise though, let's focus on a few units for expanding the army. Broodlords and Genestealers are a force to be reckoned with these days. They can scout into the midfield and bury the enemy and do a whole load of very scary attacks, recently increased to Strength 5 with the Synapse rules if you do happen to have a Broodlord in the unit. These guys are fairly usable for most armies I think, though particularly nasty for the Vanguard Onslaught. Being able to advance and charge at long distances can be spooky for these. Tyranids have got quite a few flavours of Lone Operative Lictor. These can be spooky for the enemies to fight as they can't shoot them at long range, can make them very nice for playing objective games like not being shot off primaries, doing secondary missions without things bothering them, and a Neurolictor can potentially force battleshock checks in the command phase and stop pesky enemies contesting your objectives, maybe amping up damage in the process. I feel like getting at least a few of the lone operatives on the table isn't the worst idea, and they're pretty fun models in my opinion. For a bit of heavy damage dealing, the Exocrine is often one of the gun beasts of choice for the Tyranids, just a very nice general purpose cannon that can take some chunks out of vehicles, but is particularly devastating to high save elite infantry. Things like Terminators and Space Marines would fear this. For a bit of raw aggression in a melee monster as well, the alternative build Auspex is really quite scary too. Lots of Tyranid players like to include at least some of the winged gargoyle swarms in their army as well. These can be quite nice for doing objective shenanigans again, dropping in from the skies and then using their move shoot move to get to unusual locations on the board, or potentially even doing big first turn move block type annoying things if you happen to get first turn and you want to start them on the board. Otherwise, if you want to try and build up an army quickly to a given points level, bear in mind the things that can maybe get you the most points on the board for the least money. Some of those currently are the Hive Tyrants and the Tyrannifex, both of which are genuinely quite strong in game at the moment as well. The Hive Tyrants can give you an aura of lethal hits, particularly making things like Exocrines or Maliceptors punch up well against tough tanks. Their free stratagems can be kind of crucial as well, particularly with the way that they changed in the balanced data slate. You can build either the regular one, Swarmlord, or Winged one from the same kit. Honestly, they're all really quite usable in game right now. I personally generally default to the regular one, unless you had a specific plan for one of the rest. The Winged Hive Tyrant is particularly nice in the Vanguard Onslaught detachment. The Walking Tyranid battle tank of the Tyrannifex in general is fairly good points for the money as well. These things can just be an intimidating thing to see on the other side of the table for the enemy. I'd go with the heavy-hitting Rupture Cannon to take down enemy tanks at extreme range, or maybe the Acid Spray if you want to just march them up into the midboard and threaten some scary Overwatch to burn away some enemy infantry trying to make their way onto objectives. Otherwise, for expanding the force, there are a few past discount sets that you might find about there out in the wild. The Onslaught Swarm was the Christmas Battle Force box for the Tyranids back in 2023. This one had a Winged Hive Tyrant, a bunch of Genestealers, Hormagaunts, and a Norn Emissary. Really quite a nice box in my opinion that had a good focus on a bunch of the new resculpted miniatures for the Tyranids. Again, a fair way out of production, but if you can manage to find it something close to its original price tag, could be an alright deal. They also had a boarding patrol towards the tail end of 9th edition which had a focus on Tyranid warriors plus a Broodlord and Genestealers. Bear in mind that the Gene Stealers from that one are the old sculpt, but if you don't mind about that too much, then again it could be alright. Just in general, when expanding a 40k army, I'd bear in mind there's always a good scope for just collecting what you like the look and feel of. 40k rules do change over time with balance updates, and arguably in 10th edition I'd say that Games Workshop is better than it's ever been at keeping most of the Codex relevant. Things all tend to cycle around from top tier to good, sometimes getting weak, but most things do tend to have their time in the sun. Maybe the one exception for Games Workshop balance things are that in 10th edition they seem to really want to make fortifications and flyers extra weak. For the Tyranids, that means that Harpies and the Spore Assist and things like that are probably always going to be underpowered in games, which is kind of a shame really, given that they're equal models in the Tyranids Codex. I can't help but think it'd just be better if they managed to make them a bit more balanced and gave them a bit of love. In any case, I'd build up a balanced core with some objective grabbers, some units for shenanigans, and some heavy-hitting damage dealers of one sort or another, something that can reach out and destroy enemy tough units, whether it's Maleceptors or Exocrines dealing some heavy shooting damage, Zoanthropes with their warp lances, or Tyrannofexes with rupture cannons, or perhaps some close combat threats like Old One-Eye or Haruspex or two. In general, I'd have a rough idea for a 2,000 point army list, building up to it and playing games as you go. Talking of gaming, let's cycle back to the rules. Codex Tyranids is the place that you can find the rules for the Tyranids in 10th edition, as well as alternative third-party rule sources such as Warpedia and Battlescribe and the rest. You can pick up some datasheet cards as well for some quick reference if you'd like. They can be pretty handy and easy to pore over in game. As mentioned, Tyranids have some fairly big rules changes since the balanced data slate document that came out this year. You can find that on the Warhammer community website in the Warhammer 40,000 part of the download section. It made some cool changes for Tyranids, including giving them +1 strength when they're within synapse range, which is pretty nasty, plus a few things to help out certain detachments, and handing out some helpful keywords. The current points for Warhammer 40k armies are also kept digital as well. You'll find them in the relevant section of the Monitor and Field Manual document. Again, that can be found in the same place in the download section of the Warhammer community website. Just for a quick overview of the Tyranids rules, these are their core rules in Synapse and Shadow in the Warp. Synapse helps out with your leadership. Any Tyranid units within 6 inches of a Synapse beastie, such as a Hive Tyrant, some Zoanthropes or Tyranid Warrior or something, they'll all test leadership on a 3d6, so that means you're likely to get a much higher result and far less likely to have to fail due to battle shock. Synapse now also gives you that +1 strength in melee while you're in range as well, and that can be really massive for certain units, as we mentioned with Gene Stealers being strength 5. Can be good for a few things that get to strength 10 as well, such as Hive Tyrants or the Norn Emissary. Shadow in the Warp is kind of fun as well. That's a once per game battle shock debuff, which can be more relevant in some games than others. You call it in either player's command phase, and then every enemy on the board has to take a battle shock test, potentially at -1 to that test if you have a Neuro Tyrant on the board. They are pretty handy to have in a list. The best time to do this is usually when you've got an objective that if one singular enemy unit fails that test, it'll cost them victory points, and then just have anything else that it causes in terms of disruption as nice side benefits. Often can be kind of impactful on either turn 2 or turn 3, when forces tend to be maximally engaging each other, and it could stop your opponent using some important stratagems. Otherwise, if we talk through the detachments briefly, these are the different ways that you can field your army. You get the Synapse and the Shadow in the Warp rules at base, but you also get some special rules depending on which detachment you've chosen. Crusher Stampede is the monster-focused one. This one gives you extra objective control if you're undamaged, then +1 to hit if you're below starting strength, and a further +1 to wound if you're below half strength. It's not nothing, but it's generally considered to be a slightly weaker detachment rule than most, maybe not quite as much direct help as the damage boost from invasion fleets, but they do have a fun stratagem that allows monsters to smash through walls. Vanguard Onslaught is for the Vanguard Invaders, so basically things like the Lictor variants, Gene Stealers, most flying and burrowing creatures. Those units get to advance and charge, which is nice. And they've got some powerful stratagems like can't shoot me at 18 inches or returning to reserve. They'll often be able to control the board really well and have scary threat ranges, but might focus on units that don't deal quite as much heavy hitting damage. This one does quite well in competitive play. Unending Swarm focuses on the little guys, so Termagants and Hormagaunts. Their core rule is insurmountable odds. When you shoot an Unending Swarm unit, it can make a surge move d6 closest towards the closest enemy unit, potentially tagging them in close combat. In practice, this can be a really disruptive rule if you're skirmishing over midfield objectives. Means that if your opponent lines up a bunch of shooting on a 20 model Termagant squad, and then suddenly they're in combat with you, then suddenly that unit can no longer be shot. Beyond that, they've got some other helpful horde defense options, though they did have a recent nerf that only allows them to respawn their units once per game rather than multiple times. Kind of a shame that the unending swarm now has an end. Assimilation Swarm is for the Hungry Tyranids. This one's themed around the Harvester keyword, which unfortunately only is a very few Tyranids units, the Auspex, Psychophage, Rippers and Pyrovores. This one aims to put those units on objectives to do a bit of devouring of biomass, and then they get to heal Tyranid units nearby. Either D3 wounds to a big critter, one infantry model can come back at full wounds, or 3 Endless Multitude units. Often it seems to make most sense to do that for scary infantry units. Things like Tyrant Guard could be an okay choice, but all of them are helpful enough. This one tends to be a bit niche. I've certainly seen some people make it work, but the core rule maybe isn't quite as strong as some of the rest, and the data sheets that you use it on are pretty limited. Synaptic Nexus is focused around the Hive Mind's command and control units, things like Maleceptors, Hive Tyrants, Zoanthropes, and plenty more. It kind of feels like the Synaptic Imperatives from 9th edition. Each turn you choose a big boost, either a 5+ invulnerable save, a +1 to advance and charge, and a +1 to hit, all of which once per game. Plus they have a fun stratagem to allow you to reroll 1s to hit and wound against one marked target. That can be really nice for some focused fire with things like Maleceptors or Zoanthropes or something. This one's quite a nice general purpose one, not quite as often played as Invasion Fleet or Vanguard at the moment, though still strong in its own right. Finally, we've got the Invasion Fleet itself. The thing that this one gets is hyper adaptations. You get to choose based on the opponent's army whether you get sustained hits against infantry, lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, or precision to try and take out characters on critical hits. Usually one of the first two tends to be what's gone for. It can be really quite powerful to have that if you happen to be facing against an all infantry or all tanks and vehicles army. Plus it's got some really quite strong enhancements for the big guys. A nice 5+ feel no pain stratagem to keep your monsters alive and kicking, and quite a powerful respawn hordes type option, which can make having at least a few swarms not a bad choice. Again, this one's one of the very strongest out there. Finally, putting that all together, here's just one example of what you could get as one final strong Tyranid army. This one won from a recent tournament run by an Andrew Hope who used it to take 5th at Darksphere GT. Thought it maybe wasn't the worst showcase one, as it's got really quite a lot of variety in it. Maybe going a little bit heavy on the lictors, but Tyranids can definitely do that if you'd like to. The list is led by a Swarm Lord and a Hive Tyrant. The Swarm Lord gets you command points and debuffs the enemies, and can be a scary model to move into the middle of the board. The Hive Tyrant gets you some free stratagems, and this list is Invasion Fleet, so you could be flexing out those hyper adaptations, or getting the 5+ feel no pain nice and cheap in the enemy turn. The aura of lethal hits is pretty nasty for him as well. It'd be helpful for the Exocrine and Maleceptor, and can also allow them to move quickly up the board with advance and shoot. We've then got a big scary unit of Carnifexes, Old One Eye the regenerating monster leading 2 regular Carnifexes. They're both taking max Death Spitters, so a massive amount of volume fire from them, with Old One Eye leading the brood of 3 of them. They get to reroll all hit rolls, and he'll certainly be able to carry the unit to be a big threat in melee as well. So it can be both scary when they move up, and also when they get in close. As mentioned, this one's really lictor heavy. It's got 3 regular lictors, 2 neuro lictors, and Death Leaper. Loads of annoying lone operatives to be bouncing around the board, grabbing objectives and doing secondaries. The regular lictors can rapid ingress for a first charge on outlying enemy units that they could bully in close combat. And the neurolictors are pretty nice for flipping objectives and giving you a +1 to wound boost if you can make the enemy fail battle shock. There's then a lonely Biovore and a lonely Pyrovore, both cheapish little screening units that could be alright for the backfield. The Pyrovore's got a nice flamethrower and could do actions and secondaries if needed. The Biovore spits out a Spore Mine each turn. It can still be handy for doing certain secondary objectives, such as engage on all fronts, and can just be good to have some board control and screening. The Spore Mines it spawns can prevent advances, and sometimes that could stop an opponent getting into a crucial midfield objective turn 1. There's 11 Eurogorns, very cheap screening chaff that still take a little bit of shooting to bring them down. 10 Gargoyles for fast moving objective control and their jump shoot jump shenanigans, and then finally a trio of big gun monsters, an Exocrine for some anti-elites, a Maleceptor for some big hitting strength 10 psychic in close, and a scary Tyrannifex with that rupture cannon, very tanky and hitting enemy tanks and vehicles from half the battlefield away. Overall quite a fun army that has really quite a lot of the Tyranid Codex on show. Kind of cool that such a mixed list can do quite so well these days. In any case, I think I'll leave that one there for this video. Let me know your thoughts on collecting Tyranids in 10th edition right now. Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments. Always good to hear any tips and tricks from experienced Tyranids generals. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular videos coming. I'll leave a link to that Tyranid tier list video down in the video description if you'd like something else to watch and a bit of a ranking of each unit in the Codex. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all of this content coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.